You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. This is the first in a new series of episodes about how to think rationally. Rational thinking is the engine of the modern world and of everything that's great about modern civilization. Insofar as cultures are rational, they're civilized. And everything that we have in terms of economic development, in terms of peace, prosperity, personal freedom, it all comes from our ability to think rationally. Where we have rational thoughts, we're able to live peacefully in prosperity together. Where we don't have rational thought, then we end up fighting. And I do consider myself to be part of the Enlightenment, which is a universal approach to how to think that is independent of any culture, of anywhere in particular in the world. So as well as rationality being the engine of all of the great things in the modern world, it's also, on a personal level, the technique that you absolutely need in order to make wise decisions about your life, in order to be able to properly evaluate your options and choose voluntarily what you think, rather than thinking things because you are persuaded by illegitimate authority figures, or you're persuaded by indoctrination that you've received, or prejudices that you've adopted. To the extent that you can be rational, you can actually make your own choices for yourself. And it's really hard being rational because there's a lot of very bad methods of thinking out there, and how to think rationally is kind of buried among all of these crazy ideas that are out there. There's a lot of terrible stuff written on reason and rationality. But what I'm going to talk about is essentially the method for thinking rationally and how to apply it in your life. And in order to explain that, I need to say a few things about ways in which rationality can get derailed. And one of the biggest and most important ways in which rationality has been derailed in the past has been religion. So I want to start off by telling you a little bit about that history, especially the history of Christianity, and how it actually turned back the clock on the enlightenment of humans, on our ability to think rationally. For over 1,000 years, Christianity destroyed many of the most important advances that we had made in how to think. And it's not just Christianity that's the problem. Any religion gets in the way of rational thinking. Why is that? And what effect does that have on you? Well, in order to explain that, I want to tell you a bit about history and about the history of Christianity. So before the Christians, the first amazing period of enlightenment was in ancient Greece. For the first time in ancient Greece, in the small city-states in the Mediterranean that made up the mixed and diverse civilization of the ancient Greeks, people started discovering methods for how to think rationally. There was a huge blossoming of philosophy in that period. Many, many different people writing about many different things. And one of the most important thinkers during that time was Aristotle. And the reason I'm going to focus on him is because he was the first person to discover and write down formal logic. These are the rules of determining whether or not an argument is a valid argument, a good argument, or whether an argument doesn't really follow and doesn't make sense and is not reasonable. So with Aristotle, for the first time in history, someone wrote down the rules for clear thinking, that you can learn and understand this method to determine, am I thinking clearly, or are there mistakes and errors in my thinking? Aristotle was the first person to discover and write down formal logic and the rules of formal logic. And it was only a beginning. It's been developed and logic has been expanded in many ways since then. But the amazing thing is that it seems that all our understanding of logic goes back to Aristotle. It wasn't rediscovered elsewhere. Formal logic wasn't independently discovered by other people. Everyone who wrote about this in later years seems to have linked back to Aristotle. And it's amazing that this one guy had such a huge influence, but he did. And he was only part of the process of enlightenment that was taking place in the ancient Greek world. This is about 350 BC that we're talking about. There was lots of other things going on as well, lots of other important ideas knocking around at that time. But one of the most important things is that there was this culture among the people who were thinking about ideas of free inquiry, of discovering the truth through reasoned argument and a great deal of interest in how to identify objective rules for how to think well and how to identify problems in thinking, errors in thought, and ways in which you can identify if somebody is making a bad argument, an argument that just doesn't make sense. So people started to get a handle on this method for how to know if you're making sense, how to know if you're using reason. And the amazing thing is that having discovered this, and these ideas were spread through the Roman Empire very widely, and although it was only a small group of people who were thinking about this kind of stuff, they were very influential, these ideas, in a general rationality of approach within the Greco-Roman world. Obviously, not entirely. There were many things about Greece and Rome that were incredibly superstitious and irrational, lots of weird stuff going on, lots of crazy beliefs, but the beginnings of a method about how to think rationally. And then things went backwards, and they went backwards for over 1,000 years. And the reason they did was religion. In particular, it was the establishment of one state religion in the Roman Empire, Christianity, enforced by the state, which gradually undermined rational thought and destroyed all of the amazing advances of the ancient Greek philosophers. And so in order to explain how that happened and why it happened, I'm going to explain a little bit about the history of Christianity. If you're interested in this subject, I recommend a book, The Closing of the Western Mind, by Charles Freeman. It's a really interesting history about this process of how reason and philosophy got pretty much destroyed by Christianity for over 1,000 years. What was special about Christianity was that it was very important to Christians to adhere to a common authority. Everyone had to agree to the message of Christ, his teachings, his death, his resurrection, and most importantly, they had to agree to the authority of the bishops. The bishops, through the hierarchy based on the doctrine of apostolic succession, bishops were the ones who decided what is Christian and what isn't, what is orthodox and what's heretic. Now, the thing about Christianity is, like all religions, Christianity must be based on faith, not reason. And this is very explicit from the beginning of Christianity, starting with Paul, one of the founders of the Christian church, who wrote against the philosophers, who were the ancient Greeks who were writing about how to think and how to use reason and so forth. And a number of early church leaders were very clear that they were rejecting the values of the society around them, including the philosophy of the ancient world, and they were rejecting reason and moving towards faith. And faith meant accepting what the church authorities said. Now, they had to reject reason as part of Christianity because the ideas within the early church of Christianity were impossible to agree on through reasoned argument. They were incoherent ideas, and there were huge arguments among the early Christians about what the true faith would be. There were different sources of doctrine. There were a whole variety of different scriptures. Some ancient Greek philosophical ideas were adopted, and in particular, Platonism was incorporated to some extent in Christianity. But there were huge arguments because there were a number of things about Christianity that could not be solved through reasoned argument. For example, was Jesus a god? Or was he the Son of God? Or was he also part of God? And did God abandon him when he was killed or not? And there were huge arguments about all of these things, which ultimately arrived in the Catholic Holy Trinity. But the point was, these arguments among different early church leaders couldn't be solved through reason because there wasn't any reasonable answer to any of these questions. An orthodox set of ideas had to just be adopted by authority of the bishops because there's no way to use reason to come to a conclusion about such questions as whether or not Jesus was a god or not, or exactly what kind of a god he was. Now, none of this would have necessarily mattered very much in terms of the evolution of rationality and methods for thinking if it wasn't for the fact that Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. And that was a hugely important thing because when that happened under Emperor Constantine in 306, Christianity became a state religion, and it became an ideology used to try and keep the people of the empire in line. And because it was a state religion, it was also enforced on the subjects of the Roman Empire. First of all, becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire changed Christianity in really important ways. For example, it became a religion of war. Suddenly, Jesus was a figure used to justify war when originally he was a peaceful figure. And there were tax exemptions for the clergy. So the clergy suddenly became members of the bureaucracy of the state of the Roman Empire. Christianity was used to reinforce slavery, and it became a method of thought control for the Roman Empire. The ideological person most behind turning away from reason was Augustine, who lived until 430. He was one of the most harsh critics of reasoned argument and moved towards a faith-based approach to thinking. But things really got serious under Emperor Justinian in 527, when he ended toleration for pagans, and it became an offense punishable by death to worship other gods. And so for the first time after 900 years, the academy in Athens that was founded by Plato was closed in 529. And what this means is that for hundreds of years, the official ideas of the Roman Empire were against using reason and for using faith. They were against the whole idea of open rational inquiry, because that was thought to be questioning of the religion, and it was thought to be blaspheming. And for hundreds of years, nothing useful was done in terms of improving our method to think within the Western world, within Western Europe. Some stuff happened outside the Christian world. In particular, the texts of Aristotle and others were preserved in the Muslim world. Arab scholars translated them and kept these ideas from being lost forever. But for hundreds of years, through the Dark Ages, basically, people stopped having clear written methods for how to think rationally. And very, very slowly, things started to change. And there was a kind of liberalization that took place within the Christian world, where people started to rediscover the texts of the ancient philosophers, originally through Arabic sources. They translated them back from Arabic, and then they eventually started to find the original Greek versions. And gradually this started to change Christianity itself. And Thomas Aquinas, who was born in 1225, was actually a very important Christian philosopher, Christian thinker. And the most important thing about him was that what he basically did was re-imported Aristotle's ideas about logic and reasoned argument back into the Christian world. He Christianized Aristotle, essentially, and insofar as he did anything, what he basically did was adopted all of Aristotle's methods of thinking. And by doing so, he opened up the opportunity for there to be Christians who could use reason and not just faith, who could start thinking through reasoned arguments again. Thomas Aquinas was a very important initial person opening things up, and gradually this slowly led to the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, real flowering of rational thought. I'm going to come on to all of that in another episode, but the important point that I'm making in this episode is, if you want to be rational, religion gets in the way. And the reason it gets in the way is because in order to believe in religion, you have to use faith, not reason. And when the Roman Empire adopted Christianity as an official religion, that actually destroyed much of the advanced methods of thinking that had been developed from the ancient world. Things are very different now. We live in more secular societies in the West, and religion plays much less of a role, much less of a controlling role. But I think it's really important to understand that in the past, it had a hugely detrimental effect on people's ability to think rationally. And sometimes people think that we live in Western civilization and that Christianity is a very important part of that Western civilization. From this perspective, Christianity actually almost destroyed Western civilization. For over 1,000 years, we lost many of the advances in rationality that came before Christianity, and that were only sort of slowly rediscovered again when Christianity started to mellow out and become more liberalized. When that happened, we got this amazing revolution in thinking called the Enlightenment, and that's where a lot of the modern ways of thinking rationally really kicked in. And I'm going to talk about that more in another episode, but I think I'm going to stop it here because this is enough to chew on for one episode. If you want to think rationally, you need to really understand the problem of religion in thinking rationally, and I really recommend looking at the history of Europe and looking at this book, The Closing of the Western Mind, is a great book. In order to think rationally, you have to free yourself from religion. Insofar as your thinking is determined by faith, then you're not using reason. What happens when you don't use faith and you do use reason? And how do you think through questions like morality and other topics of these kinds rationally? I'm going to come on to all of that in further episodes in the series. If people are interested, and I would like to hear your thoughts about this, because this is a little bit of a departure from some of the other topics I've talked about. So let me know what you think. I'd love to hear your thoughts. That's all for this week. I'll be back next week with another episode. In the meantime, I hope you have a great week.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you have feedback about the show, please email jake@thevoluntarylife.com. If you enjoyed this program, please share the podcast with your friends or click the donate button on thevoluntarylife.com.